I have a degree in fine arts also, and that's actually what first guides me in the creation of gardens. I use the elements and the principles of art: form, color, shape, texture, rhythm, right? Variety, harmony, in all the placemakings that we do. And so today what I'd like to do is show a combination of residential and some institutional work from inspiration through construction, and illustrating some design concepts and principles and thought processes that hopefully you can take away and use in your own work. A little bit about our firm. We are a firm of landscape architects. We do a lot of public gardens: Mount Cuba Center, Longwood Topiary Gardens, Ryman Gardens, and Marion Coffin Gardens, Bartoli Park, the U.S. Botanic Garden, and we also do historic restoration. And restoration is different than than renovation. So we go back to a particular point in time, like the Nemours Mansion and Garden in Delaware. We also did the master plan and have been involved a lot with Chanticleer and Lewis Ginter Botanic Garden. One of the challenges and concepts that we came up with in the initial planning of Chanticleer was, which was radical at the time, going back about 28 years ago: how do you make a parking lot not a parking lot? How do you make a parking lot a garden? We wanted to inform the visitor immediately when they came off the road that they were entering somewhere special. And so we designed it as not parking lot with plants, but a garden with parking. We do healthcare work, institutional and ecological planning. The institutional work is like corporate work or university work. Healthcare, we've done many projects with hospitals, and that allows us to create healing gardens or meditation gardens, gardens where people are dealing with often life-threatening situations and they need a place to heal spiritually. And private estates. We do master planning and much work with private residential gardens throughout the country. I'd like to start with the English poet, Alexander Pope, who wrote back in 1731, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the first line in particular: consult the genius of the place in all. That is an oft-quoted piece that is used in thinking about the land. And actually, what he's referring to is an ancient Roman concept called the genius loci. And the genius loci was the protective spirit of a place. And to me, this reflects the fundamental principle that landscape design should always be responsive and in context to the place. I'm not saying we necessarily go back to Delphic encounters with Apollo, but you know, some of that initial reaction of when you go to a place and respect for a place has been supplemented by geology and hydrology and even horticulture, these sciences. And clearly the advancement we've made in sciences is immeasurable, and I use it every day, we all use it every day. You can't do work without it. But I do think it's important to just pause and return to maybe a poetic encounter, right, with a site. Every site, every place has unique qualities. And if we're so quick to start to identify things and look at it in kind of a categorizable way, we may lose that initial emotional reaction and poetic reaction to a site. So I think it's incumbent upon the landscape designer to be sensitive to the unique qualities that a site has to offer. So we start with, what is the essential character of the place? Right? What are the characteristics before designing anything? And what are the owner's requirements? Whether it's an institution, a board, a hospital, a private client, what are their requirements? Right? What programming requirements? And how does the garden, and how will the garden reflect the owner? Right? So what colors do they like? What level of maintenance do they want? right? What style are they interested in? You can tell a lot by just going into the house and looking at the artwork, or what car they drive, what their profession is. But ask those questions, right? I mean, I have a whole slew of questions I ask whenever I meet with a new client, just to get a sense of what their interests are. And ideally, of course, we strive for the integration of the built elements with the landscape, as Frank Lloyd Wright did in his masterpiece. But what happens when we're in a city, right, where nature has essentially been obliterated, and what is the sense of place there, right? How do you pause and get that poetic encounter? Or even here, in the commonplace suburban sprawl, regimented development, where's the poetic spirit there? Well, in the city, you can basically do what you want. You can respond to the client's needs, and this client does a lot of traveling in Asia, has a very minimalist, contemporary aesthetic sensibility, and that's what they wanted, right? So keep the whole thing very simple. It's not ornate, and we have privacy issues. So we created 2 planting beds, one down at the courtyard level, and it was kept very, not only sparse, but open so they can entertain, right? So it's 2 levels. And we added richness in a very subtle way, right? So when you're doing a minimalist type of design, every decision counts. People think these are easy. These are actually harder than doing something that's really effusive, because you can have people look all over the place in a very effusive garden. But here, everything counts. Everything has to be studied and weighed. And so we added the little bit of river rock around the edge to give a textural contrast, to give some subtlety and interest. And our plant of choice, bamboo, yes. What better place to plant bamboo than surrounded by concrete? I ask you, right? It's not going anywhere. It also is tough, it grows fast, it has beautiful motion, right? And it provides it's narrow, and it provides that privacy screen that the client really wanted on the 2nd floor. So looking down, you can see the courtyard, the other planter, the bamboo here, and gardens like this, as I mentioned, are subtle. And one of the characteristics is to play off of light, to use the wall as a backdrop for the play of light. And so we limbed up the bamboo to show off the canes, which gives it an incredibly sculptural aspect to it. And that lets the light dapple through and change throughout the day. And there's the privacy from the bathroom. So in contrast to the urban condition that I just showed you, okay, this is typical of our region, the Brandywine Valley up in Pennsylvania. This is a 40-acre site. It is here, cuts kind of through the middle of the woods, wraps all the way around, and returns. Only the land was here when we started. There was no houses or anything. This region is characterized by the gentle hills, the valleys, woodlots, right? And the owner wanted orchards, a pool, a barnyard, the residence. I do want to call your attention, so here is the approach, and this is the way in. And you can see the drive comes and hugs the woodline edge, which I'll get into, but this is a nice aerial view. Hedgerow, barn, view beyond. So the site planning involved the placement of the house, right? All the outbuildings, the entry drive, as I mentioned, fences, orchard, swimming pool, and the gardens. And this raises the issue of choreography, right? How does a garden reveal itself? Do you get it all at one vantage point and kind of bring it all in, or does it slowly reveal itself through a series of experiences? Are you going to eclipse certain views and have it be a surprise? So that's something to think about, is how all these pieces fit together. So coming in on the drive, I showed you, it's a sharp turn off the road. On the right, which you don't really see till you come in, is the orchard. So that's an immediate experience. Now, the owner wanted the designer's hand to be light, right? But with that in mind, we're not afraid to sculpt the land if need be. So we sculpted this to create the experience of the entry. The drive, as you saw, hugs the woodland's edge, and we played with the land to give it some of that gentle characteristic of the Brandywine Valley. The drive is between the woodland and the field. Right? It follows that bend, and it goes up a rise. Right? The trees frame it on one side and then a little bit on the other side. And then as it dips down, you get a view. And you get a view to the sheep shed and a glimpse of the residence beyond. We planted all these trees, some of which were quite large when we first got them. We craned them in. But this garden has been established for quite a while, which is lovely to see a project, over 10, 15, 20 years come to maturity. Coming down the drive, right, you then see the attention is focused on the barn. Right? The entry yard is here, and the house now is eclipsed from this mature tree in the center. Here's the rise that you came down from. You can see the plantings are bold and in large sweeps because of scale. Right? You want your plantings to relate to the surrounding landscape. If we got fussy here, it just would not be in keeping with the undulation of the land. And then the gardens should respond to the architecture. Right? This is a modern house, but it's in a traditional style. Right? It has no ceremonial front door. Right? And it's almost like the entrance is incidental. We used some classic landscape vocabulary, like a single lilac by the door. And that's it. Let the lilac get mature, let it get big, have a simple fence, and move on. Now, you have to assume that over time, people's taste might change, right? Or the landscape's going to change because trees are maturing, and what was once sunny is now shady, right? So the design has to have the structure in it, both within the built elements and vegetatively, to adapt to that change. This used to have vegetables and all sorts of stuff in it, herb garden because it was much more sunny and it's close to the kitchen. But their taste changed, and now we have this entry garden with the alchemilla, which then is blooming and softens the gravel drive. So there's not a hard edge here. And the owner was interested in a certain authenticity in the agrarian vocabulary of the region. So for that, he didn't want it reproduced, he wanted us to be respectful of it. So we created this custom fence. Even the things down to black locust with hand-forged nails, and the ball and chain hinge on the gate, and the type of lampposts, right, and the paving material. Everything comes together. The crabapple was found, this is a huge crabapple, was found in a nursery that had never been pruned. Right? It had crossing branches. That's the one. That's the one we want. We don't want the one that's perfect. Right? Coming through the gate, now you are drawn towards the focal point in the distance, which is the furniture. Right? It's a somewhat eclipsed view, and eclipsing views create some mystery. So think about how the plants are going to work with your views. The furniture is the focal point. It leads you through. The path has strong directional emphasis. That leads you through. And the planting does too, with these large sweeps. Right? We have panicum on one side. This is a Chiananthus, limbing up the Magnolia virginiana so that you could see through it. I like doing a lot of see-through plants. It creates a foreground and a background effect, and again, creates that what I call a veiled view. When you approach this terrace, all of a sudden you realize there's a water feature. There's a water feature on your left, so there's a surprise. This small, intimate terrace is right outside of front doors, and it creates a transition. This level to this level. The pool is located beyond this planting. And really, how often do you use a pool? 2 months, 3 months out of the year, and then you're looking at this feature that's usually covered. So also the owner loves birds. That was another thing we found out. So the water feature is great. It attracts birds. All right. And the grand gesture. So this image I like to use to illustrate 2 points. One is texture. The texture of foliage and how you can use that to your advantage to create really interesting compositions. The other is color. And by color, I mean green. Green is a color. We get so used to green that we forget it's a color. And there's all sorts of ranges of greens, right? There's yellow greens, deep greens, the yellow green of the Itea, and the deep green of the red cedars, and even the sort of yellowish green of the river birch, and the ligularia in the foreground has that very thick, rich green, right? So think of the color and think of the leaf texture and the contrast and the effects that you can get, and how that then can play into the landscape by having the ligularia in the foreground with a big leaf and the pachysandra beyond it. It actually is playing off of the idea of the same shaped leaf, but accentuating the distance by having a large leaf in the foreground and a smaller leaf in the background. And the curvilinear line of the bed and the path, curvilinear lines on the landscape make it feel more naturalistic, if you will, or more relaxed, where straight lines have an incredibly strong directional emphasis. So the pool is elevated. The pool's up on the next level, right? It's out of the view of the house. You have to know it's there, and you take that journey of that path I showed you to get up to it, right? And it's the sunken terraces beyond, right there where those windows are, those doors are. And the other lesson here is where we're playing with the textures of all the grasses. Sometimes having just a single flower has more emphasis than having a lot of different flowers, right? So this single penstemon, the Husker's red, mixed in with all the green, it really draws your eye to it, right? That white and having the glimpse of the front door. The house was positioned, so we set the house in the landscape with the architect. It was positioned to take advantage of the sunlight and the expansive views beyond. The plants are chosen for deer resistance as well as increasing the seasonality of the time, but the trees are used as compositional elements, right? They anchor the house to the land. They also provide passive solar gain or solar blockage. So they're sited to take advantage of the season. So in the summer, they're providing shade. In the winter, the deciduous trees drop their leaves and let the sun provide some passive solar gain. And looking beyond, originally this was one long field. We brought in the hedgerow, and we brought in the hedgerow for a couple of reasons. And one of the things we did is we, again, found a nursery that was clearing a field. And here I am, talking to nursery people. We didn't want your trees. We wanted the trees you were getting rid of. So we got the black cherries and the tulip poplars, right, the mulberries, all these trees that you naturally would find in a hedgerow, and we brought them in almost bare root. If they live great. The other thing is here, you may be able to see almost like the ha-ha dip here. So thinking about topography, this was a way to solve the stormwater issue. Stormwater is becoming increasingly an important issue to address up front, not just in terms of what it used to be, which is quantity, managing the quantity. Now it's quality as well. And when we did this project, the township wanted this is going back a ways, they always had these detention basins, right? Just dig a hole in the ground, put the water in there and let it go. And we didn't want to do that in this property. So we made the suggestion, what if instead of just being this rectangle in the ground, it was long and narrow and sinuous and the water can come down? Well, of course, engineers freak out when you try to give them anything that's a little bit different than what they're used to. I love engineers, but they definitely or codify things. And we made the argument, we showed them the specs, and we did it. So this long ha-ha, you see, actually acts as a stormwater area for the water to collect and percolate, and we put the fence in it so that at certain parts of the property, when you're looking, you actually get an eclipse view, and you don't even see the fence. And the fence was actually placed in this sinuous form to act as a sculptural element instead of it just being, straight. So it works with the land as well. And details are important. I showed those little details of the river rock. Things like having a really good mason build your walls, right? And using that big rock there to act as an artful way of breaking up the wall, and the whitewash, so we're recycling materials from other barns. The milk jug, right, as an accessory that, again, reflects the history of the region. And I love this picture because it's like the house is completely merging with the landscape, right? The vine on the wall, and the layering effect gives you a lot of depth and texture, and having places to sit. Think about when you're making these beautiful gardens where people might sit and actually enjoy them, and maybe have a little sculptural, a millstone or something nearby. This is where you can get into the details. Scale, I've mentioned with the sweeps and responding to the land and the size of the garden, but also time, right? There's an interplay here between the trees and the land and the buildings. The evergreen and the deciduous plants, it kind of feels natural, but of course it's not. It's completely composed. And that gives us interest throughout the year, how the evergreens provide the backdrop for the seasonal change. But it's really now that it's at its maturity that I think it's getting its most powerful effect. Right, because the trees have canopy and weight and scale, and then using the herbaceous plants on the lower level. This again shows how important the red cedars are, to have evergreens that hold it throughout the year. The fringe tree, the Magnolia virginiana, the winterberries, right? We're in our fall glory, the grasses are blooming. The fountain grass, right? And you can see that we used a fair amount of native plants here, but not entirely. And the owner didn't want us to only use native plants, and which I agree with. And it's something that I just briefly want to address, because we keep hearing, where I am and in the horticultural world, there's a lot of emphasis now on planting native plants, right? But there are some other points I'd like to make. Plants are part of our cultural heritage, right? They're as evidenced in yards all across the country. I mentioned the lone lilac, right? This is a classic landscape expression. And lilacs were brought over here in the 1600s, right, from Europe. They're 400 years old. They're more American than I am in many respects. And so cultural landscapes have a vocabulary, and the language of that vocabulary are plants, as evidenced in Walt Whitman's "When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed," his powerful lament on the death of President Lincoln. So these plants like daylilies, boxwoods, lilacs, they can't be substituted, I find, with native plants. You can't use an inkberry instead of a boxwood. It's just not the same. You don't get the density. Inkberries always thin out at the bottom. They don't look the same. They don't feel the same. It's just doesn't have that connection. So I don't have a problem using these plants. They're adaptive. Let's just call them naturalized. Many are deer resistant, right? And they're low maintenance. And we're attracted to beauty, right? No matter what its origin. As designers, gardeners, right, and growers, first thing you do when you get a garden catalog or go to a nursery, you look at what's new, right? You don't go with what you already know. And that's ornamental horticulture. We thrive on that, right? And it's thrilling, and we lust for the newness, right? And the choices and the richness of the diverse palette allows us to do these amazing plant combinations. And almost all the bulbs that we use are not from this country, right? So it allows us to expand and extend the seasonal interest of our plantings, right? So clearly the concern for the environment and an awareness of specific plants has been a motivating factor in the movement of using native plants. And this is admirable, and I encourage it, absolutely, and we do it. Biodiversity is one of the most compelling reasons to plant native plants, to create that environment for the pollinators and the insects, so we have that web that we need. But I've had clients tell me, and I've experienced this, that they feel guilty if they're not planting native plants. Or why don't you plant native plants? They're lower maintenance, which is not true. So there's a lot of misconceptions out there. I don't think anyone should feel guilty about planting an iris, okay? So yes, absolutely, native plants. In our work, we use native plants, sometimes almost entirely, sometimes a mix, sometimes not at all, or hardly at all. It really depends on the context, right, and the color palette and the environment. So with that, let's look at another large residential project. The approach here was through woods. And this brings up the idea of, again, the choreography, density and then opening. So you've come through darkness, you've come through woods, very heavily planted with viburnums and ferns. You come to the entrance, there's a transition with the gate. You are informed that you are entering, and you see a fantastic meadow, right?
Not a bad house.
Not yeah. This is at the base of the Berkshires, so they look out on the mountains. This brings up that, again, issue of choreography, how the pieces fit together, right? And I'd like to talk about the awareness of transitions. Transitions is another concept to think about. So coming through the gate, seeing the meadow, the juxtaposition of the meadow with sort of this formal Georgian house.
Is that Sylphian on the...
Yeah, mm-hmm. That's Sylphium. We did not do the meadow. Larry Wiener did the meadow. So transitions, you've come around, you've gone through the meadow, you're coming up this drive. On the right is lawn, right? On the left is the retaining wall and a woodland garden beyond, right? So transitions can be the change of grade. It could be change of material. It could be change of texture. It could be change of plants. You have a manicured lawn and a garden. You have, something smooth, something pebbly in the driveway, and then the wall itself. You have a sense of arrival after a journey up the driveway coming into this courtyard. We planted these 2 katsuras, we craned them in, tried to get them fairly matching to act as sentinels. So when you arrive, you have that sense of arrival. And they also act as, sort of entryways up into another garden. Transitions are also accomplished with the change of grade and the steps, right? So they get signaled. The areas around the house are much more formal. This is not unusual, something to think about when you're designing, that you might have zones. And right around the house is much more formal and often much more manicured. Also, this garden, design-wise, is very different than the gardens I've shown. And as designers, we're conduits for, again, what does the owner want? What's the style, right? It's for their wishes, not what I would necessarily do at my house. And in terms of choreography, I had mentioned how does the garden reveal itself? Here's a formal type garden. You're up at the upper terrace. You've got this grand view. You kind of take it in. One of the things that gardens like this is critical of gardens like this is the sense of proportion. Your proportions have to be right on, or you just innately sense something is wrong. The other point is focal points. Here's that gate again that acts as a transition, and the jet and the urn. These all give your eye something to focus on, but the garden is actually designed around those. Right? It's a position from which the garden is designed. I would encourage you, if you go visit a formal garden and you see it from one vantage point and you think, oh, I got it, I see it, I don't have to go down in there. Well, actually you should, because gardens really change as you move through the space. Right? And this is the cross-axis, which looks very different and feels very different than the garden looked from the terrace. We have this layering effect. We used variegated red twigs. We used viburnum popcorn, all the white buddleias. It's a very restrained, elegant white and green palette. But this cross-axis experience you never would have had if you had just stayed up onto the terrace. The flower garden, our owner, obviously loves plants, but also does a lot of flower arranging. So this garden was designed to be very exuberant. And things changed. We used to have a window in the carpinus hedge at the end, but she decided not to. And gardens like this, think about the juxtaposition of exuberance with restraint. That's what these gardens are, right? With the boxwood hedge, you have strong bones, restraint, and then the exuberance is able to act out with a strong framework. It's the nature of these type of gardens. Again, the straight line, strong directional emphasis. Looking back the other way, there's a difference between solidity as compared to a veil. another concept to think about. On the left, we have lattice panels, so you can see through them to the gardens beyond. On the right, we have a solid or semi-solid brick wall. So those are subtle things. And these are, one of thousands of decisions that you make as designers. Do we want another brick wall? Maybe not, but we still want the division. So how do you do that? And when you have these strong axial lines, creating destinations. So you've come into this garden, now you see the arbor, right? And you're experiencing it, and you're drawn to it, right? So this brings up the issue of movement. How do you move through a garden? I was talking about choreography in terms of organizing spaces, but then when you're in the space, how do you move through the space? So there's the physical movement, which normally you want unimpeded, right? Clear paths, not a problem to get through. But there's also the movement of the eye. So by repetition, either by color or form or texture or the same plant, that creates a certain movement, and creating destinations creates movement as well. Right. So the arbor has very strong framework. It's very, but again, a focal point. You come down and your eye stops and you're led there. Turning the other way. Aw, come on, give me the aw. Aw. And this is also another way of signifying a transition, right? The architecture, you're continuing through an architectural element. It's semi-transparent. I mean, it's basically transparent, but it has these forms. And it has a ceiling. It has a roof. That gives a very different experience than just being in the garden. And you get the change of light, right? And these are very architectonic use of plants. We're using plants as architecture. The hedges, the verticality, and then filling that in, right? Letting the exuberance in the foreground interact with the trellis. So the use of emphasis by bringing that plant forward and then opening it up beyond to the trunks. And I find the trunks to be really sculptural, and it was something that was there surrounded by other planting, and we edited out. We said, we should take advantage of that. Let's clear out underneath it. So look beyond. Right? Look beyond. See if you can take advantage of borrowed landscape, borrowed scenery.
What color was that? Was that like a gray green? Or?
This?
Yeah.
It's like a slate blue. Positive and negative space. You may have heard these terms. Positive areas are usually defined by what is occupied, right? And negative space isn't only what isn't there. It sounds kind of funny. But it's about balancing what is there. So here you can focus on all the horizontality of the beds that we've laid out and the space around that. So where you want to punctuate with a vertical element. Using the lawn as another shape, not just lawn that's left over, but being very conscious that the lawn can be an element in the design, and therefore it creates a negative space that plays off of these horizontal beds, and they punctuate each other, right? They play off each other. And that's part of the mystery and the power of Rohan-Ji, right? The famous Zen garden, is that dynamic tension and that balance between what's positive and what's negative space. And we use that in introducing the reflecting pool. So the reflecting pool is at the base of the meadow. It's the meadow. At another time of year, you can see this is the meadow. And this used to be an informal pond, kind of naturalistic, but didn't quite work. And by suggesting a pure geometric form, that created such contrast and much more power in the dip. The owner on the second floor, he said, I love it. I'm so glad, you made this oval. And it acts as a mirror. It reflects the sky down, and it becomes a very peaceful experience.
Is that stone coping along the way?
It's actually, yes, it's stone with the concrete on the inside. So stone's only vertical. It's not really horizontal. We wanted the grass to come right up to it and disappear as much as possible. Oh, and ask questions, please. I mean, I'm talking and talking, but we could have this as more of a dialogue if you like. So you are all plants people, but you know, this sometimes gets lost of considering the adage of the right plant in the right place, right? It's good to know. I mean, select plants according to the communities that they naturally grow in, and they'll all work really well together. They'll have the same watering requirements. They'll use the same soil. So here, you know, we have Archostaphylos, we have blueberries, carex, asters, comptonia. These are all plants that grow up in the New England area really well. But this is, you know, this is a garden, right? This is designed with these sweeps. It's not attempting, it's native here, which has a very different feeling than the flower garden, right? So as we get away, we're changing our palette. And that's the other point I should mention. The benefit of using native plants is that if you're familiar with native plants, then they go back to really giving that sense of place. That you know, by looking at this palette, that this is not Arizona, obviously, or, you know, Denver. It's New England. And this is not a woodland. It's a garden in the woods. It's a garden in a woodland. Right? The trees have been edited. Plants have been designed, new planting. It's an expression. It's an interpretation. We're not doing a restoration. You would never find a woodland looking like this, right? They would be much more of a matrix mix, right? Much more space between many of the plants. So that's something to think about. Be clear in your mind what your intent is. When you say woodland garden, well, what does that really mean? Does that mean a naturalistic woodland garden where the viburnums are 10 or 12 feet apart and the ferns might be spotty and the carex might be spotty? Or do you want to do large drifts and really have a bold effect? If any of you have been to Mount Cuba, you know, you can see that they're using these native plants in large drifts to create a really powerful effect, a very floriferous effect. Changing gears a little bit, looking at an institutional project. This is a LEED project. I'm sure you're all familiar with leadership and energy efficiency design, that system that tries to encourage sustainable building practices, green building practices. And part of the LEED rating system is the landscape. And they encourage using native plants, but not necessarily, which I was surprised to find out. It really has a lot to do with not using irrigation and plants that work well within the environment. So you get more points if you use native plants, but it's not a requirement. So here you can see it's a very contemporary building, right? And the site plan, this is the facade of the building you just saw. There's a road that comes in here with entry gates. And this is the site, essentially. It's an odd shape. It's got a fence running through it. It's kind of really awkward. And so here, you know, we're tasked with, okay, we got a LEED project, and we want to use native plants, and, you know, let's do something really great. And we got this really awkward thing. And a lot, I don't know about you, but, you know, a lot of the native plantings I've seen, they either try to be naturalistic, which could, quite frankly, end up looking weedy on a place like this, or they might, you know, the intent might be to do foundation planting, but use native plants. And I didn't want to take either one of those approaches, but I wasn't quite sure what to do. So what I often do is go back to art. And I started thinking about this, and I was thinking about the Russian supremacist, the artist Malevich. And it was a movement from the 1920s, and it's based on fundamental geometry and abstraction. And I just started to look at his work again and think about this geometry, the tension between the forms, the use of color, the blockiness of it. And I thought, yeah, that's where I want to go. So I started to compose. I started to mock up my composition in relation to these lines of the fence, the lines of, this is red tipple, which is a requirement for the architecture. Yeah, that's a good question. It's not real big, 150 feet long, something like that. You'll see soon, you get a better sense. Well, that's a road, that's probably 20, so yeah, maybe even shorter than that, maybe like 80 feet, 100 feet. So I tried different iterations. I started to develop the palette, right? Finalized it, developed the planting plan, met with the client, got the okay. And you know, one of the interesting things is how a project like this, the design changes from the vantage point that you're looking at it. So you see we use inkberries as a mass, panicum, baptisia, itea, rudbeckia, and amsonia. And this is first installation right away, planting. I love the way the blue of the amsonia and the baptisia play off of the blue glass and the relationship of the planting with the architecture. Here's that massing effect, very contemporary. So it was, you know, a way of taking keeping that rhythm of the windows and the aesthetic of the building and bringing it out to the landscape and being conscious of seasonal change. This is where a dining room or a lunchroom, so people are looking out. So I was very conscious of what they would see out the windows as well as the challenge of cars going by. So the challenge was, how do you make something look good both for people who are sitting and decompressing and by the speed of a vehicle that goes by, right? So by doing this kind of pattern allowed us, and that again gets to being conscious of texture and how texture then plays off with the color. Another residential project, here's the house. This is the leach field in the front yard, more part of the septic system. And our site is right here, okay? We're tucked in. This is conservancy land beyond, which is wonderful. But one of the things right away is access, just to get down here. This is all developed. And they wanted a pool. They wanted a pool. So I came up with initial pool schematic concept design. Right, kind of contemporary. They have children. We provided a little lawn area. Really knew all along that the views were going to be to the conservancy land beyond. So it's that idea of what you're looking at, where you're looking at, taking advantage of the borrowed scenery that'll never be developed, and coming out of the house and pedestrian circulation patterns, right, and the views beyond. So this allows a garden to wrap around, have a little play area, and a nice place. And I met with them and we went over that. And what they wanted was something, they liked it, but the rectangle, they wanted something a little more romantic. Something a little more playful maybe, and a hot tub, a spa. Okay, so I'm walking around in the Brandywine Valley, I'm hiking in the woods, and I'm thinking about this, and one of the things that we have in our region is ruins. Lots of ruin in the public woods and public parks and gardens and, well, parks. And I saw the ruin, and I'm always thinking about work, and I'm thinking about this garden, and I come back and I sketch up, what if we incorporate a ruin with the pool, right? And they wanted it more romantic. They wanted, so, you know, maybe there's a bench that people can sit on. We'll lose the corners, get rid of the rectangle. So developed a new plan. A little bit more romantic pool design. The idea was to have the spa incorporated with the pool and a ruined wall as a backdrop. Same arbor, same little retaining wall for the grades, which you'll see in a minute, and presented that to them. And the idea was that there's this ruined wall with a weir that comes out in the water, cascades down into the spa. So if you want, you could sit down in the spa and lean your head back and have fun. And still see beyond. Here's a section. So here it's the wall, the water feature, the spa, which would then cascade into the pool. There's another bench here. Here's the pool deck, the arbor, the lawn for kids to play, a little retaining wall, and the garden. Great, let's go. So we had to build a road on the side just to get down to the area to work on it. Here's the conservation land beyond, so that's wonderful. And the pool starts, the footings are poured for the arbor, and this is how close the neighbor's property is right here. And this owner does not get along with his neighbor. So just getting this fence in here and doing the road was a huge deal, and the neighbor was calling all the time. The stone matches the stone already on the house, right? So there's a consistency in the materials. It adds a coherency to the garden. We're starting to introduce, there's a fireplace and the arbor piers. We recycled barn beams, brought them in. I wanted this to feel, like have a real solid feeling to it. You can see over here, I'll show you another picture. Here we go. So here's the, well, let me go back. You may notice this wall is kind of tall here. A couple things. One is the stone here is different than the stone on the house. That's deliberate. We were creating a narrative. This is all fantasy, and the narrative is this was here first. This is the ruin. The house came later, right? So then that's recycled barn stone too, which ties into the barn beams on the arbor. But the original design called for it being this tall, and this is why it's important for designers and LAs or construction, whoever designs it, you guys, go out to the site while it's under construction. Because you might get a new idea, or some things are always coming up. And one of the ideas was, do we really need to have the ruin wall that tall? It's actually beginning to block the view into the conservancy land beyond. And I thought, you're right. Let's knock it down. Let's bring it down, and let's really bring it down and bring it back up and so on. So, unfortunately for the masons, we all went out there with hammers and started breaking up their work. But they got it. They got it, and they were good with it. Mr. DuPont used to do that with a garden. He created a ruined garden at his house. And he used to, first he hired the worst masons he could possibly find so nothing would be square or true. And then every night he would go down after they left with a sledgehammer and break things up because they weren't doing it as enough of a ruin. So, I mean, and these guys really, everyone got into it, right? So the masons like, well, then we should porridge, the inside of the mechanical areas. No one's going to see that, but yeah, go ahead, It makes perfect sense. That's great. What a good idea. And the owner was into it. We were all, having fun. And sometimes this owner wanted this pool in also in time for the season. So you have planting going on, while the pool deck isn't even complete. So you have all these multidisciplinary disciplines happening simultaneously. I don't know what this arborvitae is, but my friend should patent it. It grows in the middle of a field, deer all around, and they don't eat it. And it's, you can see they're mature plants. The other side of the front yard, which you haven't seen yet, again, he wanted instant. I don't usually like to do this, but he's like, I don't want anyone to see anything. So I said, well, all right, but in a year or two, you're gonna have, or 2 years, you're gonna have to remove some. That's fine. And it's this, so what Jenks was saying earlier, you have to communicate with the client. You have to manage expectations. So we can do this, but they're going to start shading each other out then, and it's going to defeat the purpose. So in 4 years, we'll take every other one out. Okay. And here it is complete. So you can see the ruined wall. Planting, a combination of mostly native plants with the little bunny, Pennisetum, right? The lighting. So it's a place for entertaining, right? And it has that solidity that's confident, and it relates to the residents. It has romance. It's an outdoor dining room, thinking of the exterior spaces the way you think of interior spaces. They're analogous.
Are you designing your own lighting?
Yes, I designed the lighting. Thank you. Thanks. So, it's a garden that's a dialogue. It's a dialogue of walls and water, right, and plants, and the surrounding landscape, right? And it's one that actually embraces our cultural heritage, this idea of the Brandywine Valley and the ruins. And it was spurned on by the imagination of walking in there. And so, whether by art or the culture or your emotion, be inspired to create gardens that are, exciting, ecologically sound, right? Restorative, whimsical, fun, and gardens that respond to that poetic nature of the space, the genius loci. Thank you.